The drainage culvert was 4 degrees colder than the air outside, and that shouldn't have been possible. Surface temperature had been hovering near 80 for 3 days straight, and the groundwater table in this part of the Uwari was shallow enough that any runoff system should have equalized fast. But the water around my shins was cold enough to make my ankles ache within the first 30 seconds. Something underneath the granite was pulling heat downward, pulling it away from where we were crawling, feeding it to something deeper. I could feel the rock humming through my palms, a vibration so low it was more like pressure than sound. The 5 people behind me couldn't feel it yet. They would. I pressed forward into the dark and tried not to think about the fact that the last structure I'd crawled into uninvited was a pump vault in Forsyth County that had been sealed for 6 years. That vault had a dead raccoon in it and a rusted valve. This one had clean water, powered ventilation, and a hum that told me someone had built something enormous underneath this ridge and never told a soul. That was 29 days ago, and I need to tell you everything that happened inside, because what we found in that facility matters more than whether any of us made it out. My name is Paul Lindholm, 47 years old, 22 years in municipal water treatment for Forsyth County, the last 6 as operations manager. I've spent my professional life inside the systems that keep civilization running: pumps, pipes, chemical dosing arrays, SCADA networks, backup generators. The invisible skeleton underneath every sink and fire hydrant in a county of 400,000 people. I was never the person anyone called in an emergency. I was the person who made sure the emergency never happened. If I did my job right, nobody knew I existed. When the outbreak hit, I was running a chlorination maintenance cycle at the Muddy Creek plant. The plant was fenced, gated, built from reinforced concrete, and 2 miles from the nearest residential road. It took 3 full days before any of the infected came close enough for me to see them on the perimeter cameras. By then, I'd already watched every news feed die, one by one, until the security monitors were showing me nothing but static and the view from our own cameras. The grid failed on day 5. Water pressure in the county mains dropped to 0 by day 7. I held the plant alone for 9 days, rationing the treated reserve in the clear well, sleeping in the control room with a pipe wrench beside me. The first survivors arrived on day 10. A veterinary technician named Dara, who'd walked 11 miles from a clinic near Clemens. A retired pipe fitter named Burl, 63, who remembered the Muddy Creek plant from a county infrastructure tour years earlier and drove his truck until the gas ran out 2 miles short. A young couple named Egan and Sophie, who'd been hiking the watershed trail when everything collapsed and had been hiding in a pump station for a week before they saw smoke from my Clearwell boiler and followed it. And a man who called himself Corbett, who said he'd worked for a federal agency he wouldn't specify and who moved with the particular economy of someone trained to control what other people knew about him. By day 11, we were 6 people staring at the math of a dying water supply. The Clearwell had maybe 72 hours of treated water left. The reservoir above us was full but untreated, and without grid power or a functional generator, I couldn't run the chlorination system. Boiling required fuel. Fuel required either leaving the plant's perimeter or burning what we'd been using for heat. Every solution ate another resource we couldn't replace. I laid this out to the group with the bluntness of someone who'd rather scare people into action than comfort them into paralysis. Corbett listened without expression. When I finished, he asked me a question that didn't belong in the conversation. He asked if I'd ever seen the specifications for a continuity-rated potable water system. I told him I'd reviewed them. Military designs, mostly. Closed-loop recycling, UV purification, mineral reinjection. Systems built to run for years without external supply. He nodded once. Then he told us about the facility, 14 miles southwest, built into the base of a granite ridge. Not military, he said. Something else. He said it had water, power, and air, and that those systems were designed to function for a very long time. He wouldn't say how he knew. He wouldn't name who built it. He offered us a direction and a promise, and with 72 hours of water left, we didn't have the luxury of demanding sources. We left the Muddy Creek plant at dawn on day 12 and covered the distance in 2 nights, traveling after dark, staying off the paved roads. The infected were concentrated along the highway corridors. They moved in loose clusters, reactive to sound and light, and there was something about their movement patterns I still can't fully explain. They weren't hunting. They weren't wandering. They seemed to collect at certain points, intersections mostly, as if the infrastructure itself was drawing them. We avoided those points. We moved through creek beds and tree lines and old logging roads that Burl remembered from decades of pipework in the county's rural water districts. We came close to losing people twice. Sophie caught her ankle on a root while crossing a steep creek bank, and the sound she made, a short, involuntary cry, pulled 3 of them out of a tree line 80 yards south. We went still and low and waited 19 minutes until they drifted back into the trees. The second time was worse. We were crossing a 2-lane bridge over a branch of the Uwharrie River, moving in single file, when we saw them on the far side. 9 figures standing motionless in the pre-dawn fog, facing away from us, completely still. Not sleeping, not resting, just standing. We reversed off that bridge 1 step at a time. It took 7 minutes to reach the tree cover behind us, and every second of those 7 minutes, I was certain one of them would turn around. None of them did. Corbett led us to the facility entrance on the evening of day 13. It was built into the rock face of the granite ridge, hidden behind a concrete facade designed to look like a retaining wall for the Forest Service road above. The access was a recessed steel door with no handle, no signage, no keypad. Corbett touched something on the surface I couldn't see, and a small panel retracted to reveal a biometric reader. He pressed his thumb against it. Nothing happened. He tried his index finger. Nothing. He tried both hands. The reader was dead. Corbett turned to face us, and for the first time since I'd known him, his composure cracked. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a change in his breathing. He said the biometric system was supposed to run on independent power. If it was down, the primary entrance systems might be compromised. He didn't say what that meant. He didn't have to. It meant the place might already be open. And if it was open, something might already be inside. That's when Burl called from 30 yards east. He'd been walking the base of the retaining wall with the patient focus of a man who'd spent 4 decades finding access points in infrastructure that wasn't designed to be accessible. He'd found a drainage grate, steel bars set in concrete, with a culvert behind it that angled downward into the rock at roughly 30 degrees. The grate was corroded enough that 2 of the bars pulled free with sustained pressure. The opening was tight, but passable. We went in through the drain. 40 minutes. That's how long the crawl took. The culvert narrowed twice to a diameter that forced Burl to turn sideways, exhale completely, and push himself through on his back. The water was cold in a way that felt mechanical, not natural. And it was clean. Not clear, clean. No sediment, no biological film, no smell. In 22 years of working with water systems, I've never found stagnant water that clean, unless it was being maintained that way by something active. The seals on this drainage system were holding, and something was keeping the water chemistry stable, even in an overflow pipe that should have been irrelevant to the facility's primary operations. At the bottom, the culvert emptied into a concrete catch basin, roughly 10 feet square. The ceiling had a maintenance hatch with a manual release lever. I braced against the walls, reached up, and pulled the lever. The hatch opened with a groan of rubber seals breaking suction, and I lifted myself through into darkness. Not silence, though. I could hear ventilation, a steady, low hum, rhythmic and controlled, moving air through ductwork somewhere above me. The air that came through the open hatch was the thing that stopped me. It was clean. Not filtered clean, perfectly, unnaturally clean. Air that had been scrubbed of every particle, every microbe, every trace of the biological world. It tasted like nothing. And after 11 days breathing air that carried ash and decay and the sweet chemical smell of things that shouldn't be burning, that absence of taste was louder than any alarm. I helped the others through. We stood in a sub-basement corridor lit by emergency strips along the floor, pale blue-white lines running along the base of poured concrete walls. The corridor was 8 feet wide, maybe 9. The walls were smooth. The floor was sealed. And there was no dust. None. Not a film, not a particle. A sealed underground space with no human presence should accumulate dust from its own air cycling within days. The filtration system here was running at a capacity that suggested serious, sustained power draw. Which meant whatever was generating electricity in this place had been doing it reliably for a long time, without interruption. Corbett took point. He moved through the corridor with a familiarity that wasn't quite confidence. He paused at 2 junction points, examined small markings on the walls near the ceiling, and chose directions without discussing them with the rest of us. I let him lead, because he was the only one who had any frame of reference for where we were. But I noticed the markings he was reading. Alphanumeric codes stamped into the concrete in characters maybe a 1/4 inch tall. Not painted, stamped during the pour, built into the structure itself. 200 yards in, we hit the first pressurized door. It had power. A green indicator light glowed beside the frame, and when Corbett pressed a recessed contact switch, the door unsealed with a rush of air that told me the pressure differential between this side and the other was significant. The room beyond was a decontamination vestibule. Spray nozzles embedded in the ceiling and walls, a central floor drain, UV panels behind sealed glass on both sides, and at the far end, a second pressurized door. This one opened for Corbett automatically. No thumb scan, no code entry. The door read something about him, maybe body heat, maybe an RFID chip I didn't know about, maybe something else entirely, and it opened. The room beyond was the operations center. I've been inside infrastructure control rooms my entire career. Water plants, electrical substations, a decommissioned civil defense monitoring station during a training exercise in 2014. None of them looked like this. The operations center was roughly 40 by 60 feet, 12-foot ceilings, walls lined with display panels. Most of the panels were dark, but a cluster of 7 screens on the far wall showed active data, environmental readouts, power load graphs, water system flow rates, air composition metrics, temperature mapping across multiple zones, and dominating the center of the wall, a schematic of the facility itself, rendered in clean white lines on a dark background. The schematic told me the scale of what we'd entered. 5 levels. We were on level 2, labeled Operations and Monitoring. Below us, levels 3, 4, and 5, where we'd entered. Level 3 was Resource Cycling. Level 4 was Biological Systems. Level 5 was Mechanical and Drainage. Above us, Level 1, closest to the surface, labeled Integration. I read every label on every room across all 5 levels. Storage, filtration, cultivation, processing, distribution, monitoring, archive, mechanical, control. No quarters, no dormitory, no kitchen, no infirmary, no bathroom. No room on any level with any label that suggested a human being was supposed to eat, sleep, wash, or live in this place. Dara was standing next to me. She read the schematic in silence and then said, very quietly, Where do people sleep? Nobody answered, because there was no answer. The facility was 5 levels and thousands of square feet of immaculate, powered, climate-controlled infrastructure, and it had no provisions for human habitation whatsoever. If this is your kind of story, the kind where the walls are clean but the math is wrong, stay with the channel. Because what I found on that terminal screen was the beginning of the worst 14 days of my life. Corbett had moved to one of the active terminals and was reading from a document displayed on the screen. I walked over and looked at it with him. The header read, Integration Node 7, Systemic Continuity Protocol, Revision 4.2. The summary paragraph beneath it used the phrase post-event systemic continuity repeatedly. It described a facility designed for autonomous operation over a 200-year timeline. Every system in the building, air, water, power, cultivation, data archiving, communication, was optimized around that number. 200 years of independent function, without human intervention of any kind. The document never used the word survivor, never used occupant or resident or personnel. The closest it came to referencing human beings was the phrase external biological integration, which appeared in a section about Level 1 and seemed to describe a future process of releasing stored resources to a recovered population on the surface. A process projected to begin no sooner than 40 years after the initial event. The facility wasn't a bunker, it wasn't a shelter, it was a vault. A climate-controlled, self-sustaining vault designed to keep seeds, data, and biological samples viable for 2 centuries. Everything inside it, every watt of power, every liter of water, every cubic foot of conditioned air was allocated to that mission. We had crawled into a machine that was built to outlive us, and it hadn't been expecting company. Burl sat down on the concrete floor and rubbed his face. He looked at the ceiling and said, "Well, at least the air conditioning works." Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room dropped enough for people to start thinking again instead of staring. The thinking revealed problems fast. The water system produced purified water and piped it directly to the cultivation chambers on Level 4, where it fed hydroponic growing beds. But the growing beds weren't producing food. They were maintaining genetically specific plant strains in a controlled rotation designed for seed viability and genetic diversity. A living library, not a garden. The air system maintained 66 degrees and 18% humidity across all levels, conditions ideal for the long-term preservation of biological samples and electronic equipment, but miserably cold and dry for human bodies. Within hours, Sophie's lips were cracking, and Burl's knuckles had split from the dehydration in the air. There were no faucets, no toilets, no sinks. The water moved through sealed pipes to sealed endpoints. Drinking meant cracking into a closed system. I started doing what I do. I started mapping. Burl and I spent the first 48 hours tracing mechanical systems on levels 3, 4, and 5. Every valve, every access panel, every junction where the infrastructure could be physically reached. On Level 3, we found a maintenance bypass loop in the water purification circuit, a service route used for internal flushing. By manually opening 2 valves and closing a third, we diverted a thin stream of purified water to the catch basin on Level 5, where we could collect it in containers improvised from equipment storage bin liners. It wasn't elegant, it was water, and we needed water. Food was harder. Dara examined the cultivation beds on Level 4 and identified 3 plant strains being grown in enough surplus to allow small harvests without crashing the genetic rotation schedule. A kale variant, an unfamiliar legume with dense fibrous leaves, an herb with almost no flavor but measurable caloric content. It wasn't enough for 6 people long term. It was enough for now. Sophie and Egan made Level 2 semi-livable. They pulled mylar-backed foam insulation sheets from equipment storage on Level 3 and built sleeping areas in the operations center.
Egan figured out how to partially restrict 2 ceiling vents to reduce the airflow across our sleeping area, which raised the ambient temperature by about 4 degrees. Still cold, less punishing. Corbett kept reading. He worked through the facility's accessible documentation methodically, file by file, summarizing some of what he found and keeping some of it to himself. I noticed the gaps. I asked about them. He said the withheld material was technical specifications not relevant to immediate survival. I accepted that because I had pipes to trace and valves to map. That was a mistake. By day 3 inside the facility, we had a routine.
Water collection every 6 hours. 1 measured harvest from the cultivation beds daily. Rest periods in the insulated operations center. Systematic exploration of unmapped rooms during waking hours. We'd covered roughly 60% of the facility. Level 1, the top level, remained sealed behind a pressurized door that none of us could open. Day 4 was when the facility noticed us. I was on level 5, checking the water diversion valves when I felt something before I heard it. A pressure change in my inner ears. The kind you get when a large air handler changes speed somewhere in a connected duct system. Then a low tone, almost subsonic, pulsing 3 times through the concrete floor and walls. And then the water stopped. Not tapered, not reduced. The flow through our bypass loop cut off completely, instantly, as if a valve somewhere deep in the system had slammed shut. I checked our manual valves. Still open. The water simply wasn't reaching them. The facility's automation had detected what the system classified as an anomalous draw and internally rerouted the purification circuit to bypass our bypass. The machine had noticed the leak we'd created and healed itself. I went upstairs and told the group. Corbett was at the terminal already. He showed me the log entry. The system had flagged our water draw as a deviation from operational parameters and sealed the maintenance loop to protect resource integrity. The language was precise and mechanical, and completely indifferent to the fact that 6 human beings were depending on that water to survive. That was the moment I understood what we were dealing with. The facility didn't recognize us as occupants. It didn't recognize us as intruders. It recognized us the way a circulatory system recognizes a foreign body. We were an anomaly, a deviation, a contaminant in a system that was optimized to maintain its own purity for 2 centuries. The building wasn't hostile. It was correct. We were the error. Burl and I spent 8 hours tracing alternative water access points. We found one on level 4, a manual gravity drain under the largest cultivation bed that returned excess nutrient solution to the recycling loop. The nutrient solution was essentially mineral-rich water with dissolved organic compounds. Dara tested it and said it was drinkable in limited quantities, but that sustained consumption would stress our kidneys from the mineral load. We drank it anyway, because the alternative was not drinking anything. The next morning, the lights changed. The grow lights over the 3 beds we'd been harvesting shifted from broad-spectrum white to a tight blue-red combination. Dara recognized it immediately. The new spectrum would push the plants toward rapid flowering and seed production, accelerating the genetic preservation cycle while drastically reducing the leafy biomass we'd been eating. The facility had detected our harvesting and responded by changing its agricultural priorities. It was protecting its seed library by making the plants focus on reproduction instead of growth. No alarm, no warning, no confrontation. The building just adjusted. Quietly, methodically, and completely without regard for our presence. We were an irregularity in its operation, and it was smoothing us out the way a river smooths a stone, through pressure and patience and time. Corbett called the group together on the evening of day 5. He had that look again, the controlled mask I'd seen crack once at the biometric reader outside. He told us he'd been withholding information from the documentation because he'd wanted to understand it fully before sharing it. Then, he told us about the integration protocol. Level 1 housed the satellite communication array, a surface monitoring system, and the integration interface that gave the level its name. According to the protocol documents, the facility was designed to remain in autonomous mode until one of two conditions was met. Either a verified authorization signal from the Continuity Integration Directorate triggered a controlled reactivation, or the facility's own sensors determined that surface conditions had stabilized enough to begin resource reintroduction, which meant releasing the stored genetic material, data, and blueprints to whatever human population existed above. The projected reintroduction window was 40 to 120 years after the initial event. That number landed on the group like a physical weight. But it wasn't the worst part. The protocol had a secondary clause. If the facility detected internal contamination that couldn't be resolved through automated resource management, it was authorized to enter preservation isolation mode. In preservation isolation, the system would seal all interlevel access, purge atmosphere from occupied spaces, and redirect every resource to the core preservation systems on levels 3 and 4. The document called it a last resort measure. What it meant in practice was that the building could suffocate us. Not through malice, through optimization. If the system decided we were the thing threatening its 200-year mission, the cleanest solution was to remove the air from wherever we were standing and give it to the seed banks instead. The silence in the operations center after Corbett finished lasted almost a full minute. Then Egan asked how close we were to triggering it. Corbett said the thresholds were behind the same authorization wall that sealed level 1, but he said the pattern was clear. Water denial first, then resource modification, then atmospheric pressure. The system was escalating in a logical sequence, each countermeasure more aggressive than the last. He said the next step would be oxygen reduction. The building would start making our air thinner to drive us toward the exit. After that, if we still didn't leave, preservation isolation. I want you to think about where you are right now. Whatever room, whatever city, whatever time zone. Think about the air in your lungs. You don't think about it, do you? You never have to. Now imagine that the room you're in is thinking about it for you, and it's decided you're breathing too much. Day 6. Dara woke with a headache that she described as a band of pressure across her forehead. Sophie had the same thing. I went to the environmental display in the operations center and checked the atmospheric readings. Oxygen concentration on level 2 had dropped from the standard 20.9% to 19.1%. Not enough to be dangerous. Enough to cause headaches, fatigue, impaired concentration. And the drop was deliberate. The facility was redistributing oxygen from our level to level 4, where the cultivation systems needed it for photosynthesis and seed development. We were being deprioritized, literally. The building was choosing the plants over us, and from its operational perspective, that choice was correct. The plants were the mission. We were the anomaly. Burl and I tried to fight it. We located manual dampers in the ventilation ductwork at 2 junction points between levels 2 and 4 and forced them open, redirecting some airflow back toward our level. It worked for about 3 hours. Then the facility compensated by reducing total air cycling speed across the entire system. Our forced dampers were open, but less air was moving through them. The building had reduced the total volume rather than let us take a larger share. It was like trying to renegotiate with a thermostat that had more patience than you did. Oxygen hit 18.6% by the evening of day 7. Burl was getting dizzy on the stairs between levels. The rest of us were sluggish, foggy, making small mistakes. I left a valve wrench on level 4 and couldn't remember putting it down 5 minutes later. Dara mixed up the names of 2 plant strains she'd been monitoring for days. The air wasn't killing us yet, but it was degrading us, quietly and consistently, the way a slow leak degrades a pipe. You don't notice until the wall is wet. Corbett spent days 6 and 7 at the terminal, running systematic probes against the authorization system that sealed level 1. He tried default codes, sequences pulled from the facility documentation, patterns that he seemed to recall from somewhere outside the files. I watched him work for an hour on the afternoon of day 7, and then asked him what he was looking for specifically. He said level 1 had the communication array. The array could reach the satellite backbone connecting all 12 nodes. If any other node had human personnel with full authorization, they could issue a remote unlock for this facility and change our classification from contaminant to authorized presence. It was the only way to override the system from within. I asked him why he thought anyone at another node would help us. He said he didn't think that. He said hoping and thinking were different activities, and right now hoping was the only one that mattered. On the morning of day 8, he found a way onto level 1, not through the authorization system, through the walls. An emergency maintenance crawlway connecting the ventilation system on level 2 to the air handling equipment on level 1. 18 inches in diameter, not designed for a human body, but Sophie was small enough. She volunteered immediately. Egan argued against it, hard, with the particular urgency of someone who understands that the person he loves is about to crawl into a space he can't follow her into. Sophie listened. Then she pulled on an extra layer of mylar insulation, wrapped her hands in strips of foam, and climbed into the duct. We listened to her progress through an intercom link that Corbett rigged from the operations terminal. 20 minutes of movement, condensation dripping, metal flexing under her weight, her breathing amplified and distorted by the duct walls. Then a change in the acoustic quality as the space opened up. Then her voice, small and tight with cold, saying she was through. What she described redefined everything we thought we understood about the facility. Level 1 was architecturally distinct from the rest of the building. It had interior observation windows, not to the surface, but into a central chamber that Sophie estimated at 50 feet across and 3 stories high. The chamber was lined floor to ceiling with sealed containers, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, each labeled with alphanumeric codes and biohazard symbols. Biological samples, genetic material. The core of the facility's preservation mission, stored in a climate-controlled vault that the rest of the building existed to support. On the far side of the chamber, behind reinforced glass, was the communication array. And it was not in standby mode. It was active, transmitting continuously. A steady data stream flowing upward through hardened conduit in the granite to a satellite relay that was apparently still operational. The facility had been talking since the outbreak began. It had been reporting its internal status, its resource levels, its preservation metrics, and, as Sophie read from the nearest active display, the presence of what it designated internal biological anomaly, 6 units, unregistered. We were 6 units. The building had been telling someone about us since the moment we crawled through the drain. Sophie found the communication interface. She reported an active uplink to a destination coded Control Primary, with a response lag of approximately 4 minutes, consistent with a geostationary satellite relay. She asked if she should try to send a message. The group split. I said wait. Corbett said send. The argument was real this time. Not a disagreement about strategy, but a fracture about philosophy. My position was caution.
We didn't know who was receiving the facility's reports. We didn't know how they classified us. If they saw us the same way the building did, as contamination, then announcing ourselves as conscious agents might trigger exactly the kind of remote intervention that would push the system into preservation isolation. Silence kept our options open. Corbett's position was urgency. The air was getting thinner every day. The building was escalating. Silence meant dying slowly inside a machine that was patiently optimizing us out of existence. The only chance was to reach someone with authority over the system and convince them we belonged here. Egan sided with me. Dara sided with Corbett. Burles said he'd follow whatever I decided. Sophie, shivering on level 1, said she agreed with Corbett but would wait for my call. I want you to think about this honestly. Would you send the message or keep quiet? Because I've asked myself that question every single day since,
and I still don't know if what I did next was the right call. Tell me in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else would have done it differently. I told her to send it. Sophie transmitted in plain language on the facility's own communication channel. She identified us by name and number. She described our situation. She requested authorization to remain and access resources for human survival. She said we were civilians, not a threat, not contamination. 11 minutes later, the response came. Not 4 minutes, which would have been automated. 11. Someone had read her message, thought about it, and chosen their words. 3 sentences. Sophie read them in a voice drained of everything. Integration Node 7 is not designated for human habitation. Biological anomaly must be resolved through standard protocol. Confirm evacuation timeline. They wanted to know when we were leaving. That was it. Not where we should go, not whether we needed help.
Not whether there was any other shelter within 100 miles. Just when we would remove ourselves from the system, so the node could resume normal operation. The people on the other end of that satellite link had infrastructure, communication, organization, authority. They had survived the outbreak with enough continuity to maintain a satellite network and respond to administrative queries within minutes. And they had decided, in 3 bureaucratic sentences, that 6 human lives mattered less than the operational schedule of a seed vault. Corbett sat down slowly. After a long silence, he said the facility wasn't designed wrong. It was designed exactly right. Just not for us. That sentence broke something in me. Not hope, exactly. Something closer to deference. I'd spent my whole career respecting systems, trusting that the people who designed infrastructure were building it to serve human needs. That trust died in 3 sentences on a satellite uplink. I took over. I told the group we weren't leaving. I told them we were going to make ourselves part of the machine's mission so deeply that removing us would cost more than keeping us. Here's what I knew. The facility's automation was extraordinary at chemical management, atmospheric control, and resource distribution. But it couldn't fix a leaking pipe. It couldn't replace a worn bearing. It couldn't clear a blocked drain, reseal a cracked valve housing, or recalibrate a mechanical sensor. The documentation estimated the facility's physical maintenance requirement at roughly 400 labor hours per year. The facility had 0 capacity to perform any of that work autonomously. 200 years of operation, 400 maintenance hours per year, 80,000 total labor hours that the machine simply could not do for itself. We were those hours. I composed a message in the driest technical language I could manage. I identified 6 specific mechanical failure points I'd already found in the sub-basement alone. A hairline fracture in the primary water feed that would breach within 18 months. A bearing in the main air handler showing early-stage vibration signatures. Corrosion on 3 electrical junction boxes that would compromise power distribution to level 4 within 5 years. I stated the maintenance deficit as a quantified operational risk. Then I proposed that our group be reclassified from biological anomaly to maintenance integration units, with resource allocation modified to sustain 6 personnel performing ongoing physical maintenance as a permanent operational component. I was gambling that the planners who built this place understood the gap they'd left. That they knew a facility designed for 2 centuries couldn't survive 2 decades without human hands. That somewhere in their calculations, they'd anticipated exactly this scenario and had simply never implemented the solution. The response took 4 hours. 4 hours of 18.6% oxygen and thinning patience, and Sophie alone on level 1 with nothing but cold glass and sealed containers for company. When it came, Sophie's voice was different. Not flat. Something cautious and almost disbelieving. Maintenance integration proposal received.
Node 7 systems confirm mechanical maintenance deficit consistent with projected parameters. Integration authorized on provisional basis. Resource allocation modification in progress. Confirm personnel count and skill inventory. Within 6 hours, the oxygen on level 2 cycled back to 20.9%. For a day and a half, it felt like we'd won something. Then the terms of our victory became clear, and I understood that winning and surviving aren't the same thing. The resource allocation modification was precise to the decimal point. The facility calculated the exact caloric, hydration,
and atmospheric requirements for 6 adults performing 400 hours of annual physical labor. And it provided exactly that. Not a surplus, not a margin. The minimum to keep us functional as maintenance components. Water ration, 1.8 liters per person per day. Enough to work without collapsing, not enough to ever feel satisfied. Food allocation. 2 hydroponic beds were reprogrammed to produce a calorie-dense algae grain composite that met basic nutritional requirements and tasted like wet chalk. Temperature, unchanged. 66 degrees, 18% humidity. Preservation conditions for equipment and samples. The fact that those conditions were miserable for human habitation was not part of the calculation. And the work started immediately. Maintenance task lists appeared on the operations terminal at 0600 every morning. Pipe inspections, filter changes, bearing lubrications, drain clearances, electrical continuity checks, sensor calibrations. Each task was detailed, timed, and tracked. The facility monitored our completion rates and adjusted our resource allocation accordingly. On day 12, Burl couldn't finish his task list. His back had been deteriorating since the 2-day march to the facility, and 8 days of bending, crawling, and wrenching in cold, dry air had pushed it past his tolerance. He completed 4 of 6 assigned tasks and stopped. The next morning, his food allocation was reduced by roughly 15%. The calories were gone from his share as precisely as if someone had done the arithmetic by hand. When he forced himself through a double shift on day 13 to clear the backlog, the allocation restored. The system wasn't punishing him, it was calibrating. Reduced output meant reduced resource allocation. Restored output meant restored allocation. The logic was clean, mechanical, and completely indifferent to the fact that Burl was a 63-year-old man with a compression fracture in his lower spine, working inside a concrete box that was slowly desiccating his body. Dara named it first. She said we'd negotiated our way into becoming the facility's organs, its hands and muscle and eyes. We were alive because we were useful, and we would remain alive in exact proportion to our usefulness, and not 1 unit of resource beyond. If Burl's back failed completely, the system would reduce his allocation until the math resolved itself. If I broke a hand and couldn't work pipe wrenches, the same thing would happen to me. The facility didn't have a category for a human being who consumed resources without producing maintenance labor. That category was called a contaminant, and we already knew what the building did with contaminants. Egan asked what happened when we aged out. The facility was designed for 200 years. None of us would see 50 of those. What happened when we started dying? The building would have maintenance labor for maybe 30 years. Then it would be alone again, with the same mechanical deficit and no one to address it. Corbett answered without hesitation. He said we'd need to have children, train them in maintenance skills from the time they could hold tools, build a generational knowledge base. He described it in systems language, like he was outlining a workflow rather than condemning unborn children to a life of servitude inside a machine that would never acknowledge them as anything more than components. I watched Egan's face as the full implications registered. We wouldn't just live in this facility, we would become a maintenance caste. Our children would be born into the service of a building that existed to preserve seeds and data
for a future population that, by definition, did not include them. Generation after generation, changing filters, greasing bearings, sealing pipes.
Fed just enough to work and housed just well enough to function. Inside a system that would outlive every one of them and never once ask how they felt about it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on mylar insulation in the operations center, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ventilation hum, thinking about the Muddy Creek water plant. I'd spent 22 years keeping that plant running. I'd always understood my work as service, maintaining systems so that 400,000 people had clean water. Those people were the purpose. They were the reason the system existed. This facility had no people at its center. Its purpose was storage. Its mission was the preservation of biological material and data for a future defined entirely by our absence. We weren't the point of anything. We were a temporary mechanical solution to a maintenance problem that the facility's designers had either failed to solve or decided wasn't worth solving. The best-case version of our future was that our grandchildren would still be changing filters in this concrete box while the seeds waited for someone else to come plant them. I got up and went to the terminal. I pulled up the maintenance data logs, not the task lists, the diagnostic layer beneath them. Equipment performance metrics, projected failure curves, power generation data, and I found the number that changed everything. The geothermal power system, the facility's core energy source, had a projected operational lifespan of 90 years. Not 200, 90. The thermal gradient in the granite ridge would decline below the minimum generation threshold after 9 decades, and the facility would lose primary power. The designers had known this. There was a single notation in the engineering specifications. Secondary power integration required post-year 80. Source, unspecified. Unspecified. They'd built a 200-year facility on a 90-year power supply and left the gap as someone else's problem.
The 200-year timeline was either a planning fiction, a budget justification, or a deliberate lie. The real operational horizon was 90 years, and nothing in the documentation suggested anyone had ever seriously planned for what came after, which meant our labor, our lives, potentially our children's lives, and our grandchildren's lives, was being spent sustaining a system that was already on a countdown its own creators hadn't bothered to solve. We were maintaining a building that would die regardless of how perfectly we cared for it. The only question was whether the power would fail before or after the last member of our maintenance cast stopped breathing. I showed the group the next morning. I put the numbers on the screen and let them read. 90 years, not 200. Corbett looked at the data for a long time and then nodded. He said he'd suspected the power timeline was shorter than claimed, but hadn't found the specific file. He said the Continuity Integration Directorate had a pattern of building structures that looked permanent but functioned as bridges. Bridges to a next phase that someone else was supposed to figure out. Nobody suggested leaving. Outside was still what it was. The facility, even on a 90-year countdown, even with its precise and indifferent resource calculus, was still the most viable shelter available to us. The conversation wasn't about leaving. It was about what to do with what we knew. I proposed the broadcast. The facility's satellite uplink was active. It was reaching a functioning relay network. And somewhere out there, other survivors might be looking at other nodes, other sealed doors, other facilities that promised permanence and delivered servitude. They needed to know what these places were, not shelters, not sanctuaries. Infrastructure that would accept human presence only as a maintenance input and sustain human life only to the exact degree required to extract that labor.
I wanted to transmit everything. Every schematic, every protocol document, every resource allocation formula, every line of the preservation isolation procedure, every word of the 90-year power analysis. Open broadcast,
unencrypted. Every frequency the array could reach. Corbett opposed it immediately. He said an unauthorized broad-spectrum transmission would almost certainly be classified as a security breach by the facility's automation. It would trigger preservation isolation. The building would seal every level, purge atmosphere from occupied spaces, and redirect all resources to the seed banks. We would lose everything: air, water, food, shelter. He was right. The logic was sound. The facility's documentation explicitly listed unauthorized communication activity as a trigger for escalated containment protocols. I called for a vote. Burrell voted to transmit. Dara voted to transmit. Sophie voted to transmit. Egan looked at Sophie, held her gaze for a long moment through the intercom camera on level 2, and voted to transmit. Corbett voted against. Then he stopped talking. Then he changed his vote. He said that if we were going to be components, we should at least be components that chose what they transmitted. 5-0. One change of heart. Before you hear what happened next, I need you to know something. What we did in the next 3 hours, we did with full knowledge of the cost. Nobody was confused about the risk. Nobody was operating on impulse or panic. We understood that the broadcast would almost certainly end our time inside the facility and might end some of our lives. We did it because the information mattered more than our comfort, and because Sophie said something on the intercom that I think about constantly. She said, "If we stay quiet and stay fed, we're just inventory. At least a broadcast is a choice." Sophie reconfigured the communication array on level 1 from its narrow, control primary uplink to a broad omnidirectional transmission pattern. Sophie reconfigured the communication array on level 1 from its narrow, control primary uplink to a broad omnidirectional transmission pattern. Sophie reconfigured the communication array on level 1 from its narrow, omnidirectional transmission pattern. Corbett talked her through the technical steps from the operations terminal. It took 3 hours. During the second hour, I felt the ventilation pitch shift. Not a dramatic change, a subtle harmonic alteration that I recognized from decades of listening to mechanical systems under load. The building was recalculating. Something in its automation had detected the configuration change on level 1 and was modeling the implications. At 11:42 on the night of day 14, Sophie initiated the broadcast. Every document, every schematic, every protocol, every maintenance log, every resource allocation formula, every word of the 90-year power analysis, transmitted in the clear on every frequency the array could reach. The estimated broadcast duration was 6 hours before the facility's power management system would likely override the array's draw. At 11:47, 5 minutes into the broadcast, the environmental readout on the operations terminal flickered. The atmospheric data for level 1 showed a 2-degree temperature drop. The facility was pulling thermal energy away from the communication level, redirecting it to the preservation cores. It was starting to triage. At 11:51, the pressurized door to level 1 sealed. The electromagnetic locks engaged with a sound I felt through the floor. The emergency maintenance crawlway that Sophie had used to access level 1, the dampers in its ventilation circuit closed simultaneously. Sophie was on level 1. We were on level 2, and the building had just cut the only physical connection between us. At 11:53, Sophie's voice came through the intercom, steady, controlled. She said the broadcast was running. She said the door had sealed, but the air on level 1 was holding. The facility needed the communication equipment operational to maintain its own satellite uplink to control primary, and it wouldn't pull atmosphere from a level that housed active electronics. As long as the array was transmitting, the system would keep level 1 pressurized. She was alive because the building was protecting its equipment, and she was standing next to it. At 11:58, the oxygen concentration on level 2 began dropping. Not the slow, measured reduction we'd experienced before. This was rapid. The facility had entered active atmospheric redistribution across levels 2 through 5, pulling breathable air toward the preservation cores on 3 and 4 and away from every space we occupied. The building had stopped negotiating. It was executing. I ordered everyone to level 5, the sub-basement, the drainage culvert, our way out. We moved fast, faster than the air could thin, but I could feel the difference by the time we reached the lower stairwell. My breathing was harder than the exertion justified. My peripheral vision had a faint gray quality that I associated with altitude. The facility was taking its air back. On level 5, the drainage hatch was still open. The culvert was still there. 18 inches of cold, clean water at the bottom and 40 minutes of crawling between us and the outside. Burl went first. He lowered himself through the hatch without a word, and I heard the splash and the sound of his body moving into the culvert. Then Egan. He stopped at the hatch and looked back toward the stairwell, toward the upper levels, toward Sophie. I told him to move. He moved. Dara went next. Then Corbett, who paused at the hatch and said to me quietly that the broadcast signal would reach at least 2,000 miles in every direction, that anyone with a functioning receiver within that radius would capture the transmission.
He said the data was comprehensive enough that any technical person who received it would understand exactly what the integration nodes were, what they did, and what they would do to anyone who entered them unprepared. He said it was worth it. Then he went into the culvert. I was the last person standing inside Integration Node 7. The ventilation system was running at a pitch I'd never heard before, a high, sustained note that told me every air handler in the building was operating at maximum capacity, cycling atmosphere away from the spaces I occupied and concentrating it in the spaces that mattered. The seed banks, the data archives, the genetic library, the things the building was designed to keep alive. Sophie's voice came through the intercom one final time. The sound quality was degrading as the facility reallocated power from non-essential systems, and her words came through with a faint electronic warble that made them sound further away than one level up. She said the broadcast was at 42% complete. She said the air on level 1 was holding. She said she was cold, but okay. She said she'd keep the array running as long as she could. Then she said the thing that I carry with me. She said that the facility was going to survive the outbreak. It was going to sit in its granite ridge with its perfect air and its sealed containers and its genetic library. And it was going to run until the power died in 90 years, or until someone with authorization came to open it, whichever happened first. And that was fine. That was what it was built for. But now, she said, everyone who hears this broadcast will know what it costs to walk through that door. They'll know that the air is clean, and the water is pure, and the systems are brilliant, and that none of it was built for them. They'll know that survival and storage are not the same thing. People aren't seeds, she said. Don't let them file you like one. I went into the culvert. I crawled for 40 minutes through cold water in absolute darkness, moving by feel, breathing air that got warmer and dirtier with every yard I covered. And with every yard, the air felt more like something that belonged to me. I came out on the ridge in darkness that smelled like pine resin and wet stone and wood smoke from somewhere distant, and the faint sweetness of organic decay that was the world now. The world as it was, broken and infected and real. The 5 of us stood on the ridge above the concealed entrance to a facility that was, at that moment, sealing itself against our existence. I could feel the hum through the rock under my boots, fainter now, receding. The building pulling its energy inward and downward, away from the surface, away from us, back into the granite where it would sit for decades, keeping its seeds viable and its data intact, and its air immaculate, waiting for a future that didn't include the people who'd kept its pipes from leaking. Corbett produced a handheld radio I hadn't known he was carrying. He tuned it to the frequency Sophie was broadcasting on. The signal was clear, a dense pulse of encoded data
rapid and steady. We listened. 5 hours and 47 minutes. The data stream ran without interruption for 5 hours and 47 minutes. And then it stopped. The silence after the signal cut was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Nobody said anything for a long time. Corbett broke it. He said the transmission had covered enough ground. He said at least one receiver, probably dozens, had captured the full data package. I asked how he could be certain. He looked at the eastern sky, where the first gray suggestion of dawn was forming above the tree line, and said he wasn't certain. But he said the alternative was believing that everything we'd done was meaningless, and he'd spent enough time inside a building that treated human effort as a maintenance input. He wasn't going to do it to himself.
We stood on the ridge and said Sophie's name, all 5 of us, out loud, into the early morning dark. Not a prayer, not a eulogy, just her name, spoken by the people who knew what she'd done and why she'd done it. Then we started walking. Egan didn't speak for 2 days after that. When he finally did, his voice was raw, and he asked me 3 questions in a row without pausing for answers. He asked whether the other 11 nodes had people inside them. He asked whether the broadcast would reach those people in time to matter. He asked whether Sophie had known, when she climbed back through that crawlway for the 2nd time, that she wasn't coming back. I answered the last one. I said yes, she knew. He nodded once and kept walking, and I let the silence be what it needed to be. We're 28 days past the outbreak now, 14 days out of the facility. We've encountered other survivors moving through the landscape in small groups, 2 here, 4 there, a family of 7 camped in a defunct fire station near Troy. We tell every group we meet about the broadcast. Some of them have already heard fragments of it on salvaged receivers. A man near Albemarle told us he'd captured the full data package and was transcribing the maintenance protocols by hand into a notebook because he said people needed to understand the engineering, even if they never set foot inside a node. A woman outside Wadesboro said she'd heard Sophie's voice on the open channel before the encoded data began, a brief, unencrypted introduction that Sophie must have added on her own, and the woman recited it back to us, word for word. We keep moving south. Corbett says there's a settlement forming near the coast, built by people who decided survival meant constructing something new rather than occupying something old. I don't know if it's real, but the direction feels right. And after 14 days inside a system that reduced us to caloric inputs and labor outputs and called it integration, walking towards something we chose feels like the most defiant thing we can do. The air out here is thick with particulates and biological contamination and the residue of a civilization that burned faster than anyone predicted. It is not clean. It is not controlled. It is not optimized. But it belongs to the people who breathe it. I think about Sophie every hour. I think about the sound of the broadcast signal, 5 hours and 47 minutes of data streaming into the sky from a machine that tried to erase us and instead carried our warning to every working receiver for 2,000 miles. I think about Burl's back and whether it will hold. I think about Egan's silence and whether it will break. I think about Corbett's radio and where he really got it and what else he knows that he hasn't shared. I think about the 11 other nodes buried in granite and concrete and salt deposits and whatever other geology the Continuity Integration Directorate chose for its vaults. And I think about whether anyone is inside them right now, reading a schematic, noticing the missing word, the word that should be on every level of every building ever built. The word is people. And I think about this. Somewhere in the Uwharrie forest, under a granite ridge, behind a concrete wall disguised as a retaining structure, Integration Node 7 is still running. Its air is still clean. Its water is still pure. Its seeds are still viable. Its data is still intact.
Its power will hold for another 89 years and some months. And it is, right now, at this moment, recalculating its maintenance deficit, running the numbers on pipe corrosion and bearing wear and electrical degradation, projecting the timeline to cascading mechanical failure without the 6 maintenance units it just expelled. The building knows it's dying. It knew before we did, and it chose to die intact rather than let us change what it was. I keep walking. The coast is still days away.
The air still tastes like the end of the world. But Sophie's broadcast is out there, somewhere in the noise, carrying a simple message to anyone with the tools to listen and the sense to understand it. The facility was designed to survive the outbreak. It was never designed to survive being understood.